It makes no sense, Dr. Alastair Finch muttered, his voice tight with a frustration he rarely showed. In the most exclusive suite of Montclair Pinnacle Hospital, surrounded by the most advanced medical technology money could buy, the world-renowned allergist was utterly stumped. His patient, the son of the powerful Davenport family, was deteriorating from a mysterious ailment that defied every test. "You're the best, Doctor. Do something," Mrs. Davenport pleaded, her voice sharp with panic and entitlement. In the corner, quietly observing, was Nurse Elena Vance. They saw her as just a pair of hands to check vitals and change 4 bags. But as she looked at the boy's unique rash and listened to his shallow breathing, she didn't see a medical anomaly. She saw the ghost of a rare wildflower from her childhood home in the Appalachian Mountains. She stepped forward, her voice soft. "Dr. Finch, perhaps if we consider." He cut her off with a condescending glare. "Nurse, this is a highly complex diagnostic situation. Please, leave the thinking to the professionals." He turned his back on her, a fatal mistake. For in that moment of pure arrogance, he dismissed the one person who held the impossible key. They thought she was nobody, but this humble nurse was about to shatter their world and expose the ignorance that hid behind their prestigious degrees. The silence that followed Dr. Finch's dismissal was heavier than any sound. It was a thick, suffocating blanket of pure hierarchy. Elena Vance felt the heat rise to her cheeks, a flush of humiliation that was thankfully hidden by the dim lighting of the VIP suite. She retreated to her station in the corner, her movements precise and silent, becoming the invisible fixture they expected her to be. The rhythmic beeping of the cardiac monitor seemed to mock the tension, each pulse a countdown to a crisis the room's most brilliant mind couldn't solve. Mrs. Davenport, a woman whose life was a fortress built of wealth and influence, began to pace. Her silk blouse whispered with every agitated movement. She ignored Elena completely, her eyes fixed on Dr. Finch as if trying to extract a cure through sheer force of will. "Alastair," she said, her voice dropping the pleasantries. "My husband is on the phone with the hospital board. This is not some common case you can pass off to a resident. This is my son. Find an answer." Dr. Finch, a man who thrived under pressure, squared his shoulders. His arrogance was a suit of armor, and he wore it well. "Eleanor, rest assured," he began, his tone shifting to one of theatrical confidence, designed to suit the powerful. "We are moving beyond conventional diagnostics. I'm ordering a full-panel cytokine assay and a genomic sequence to check for rare autoimmune markers. This is cutting edge, exploring possibilities that most physicians wouldn't even dream of." He rattled off the terms like incantations, a complex language intended to mystify and impress, but Elena knew what it really meant. He was casting a wide, expensive net in the dark, hoping to catch something by sheer luck. Dr. Ramirez, his young, ambitious shadow, nodded vigorously, tablet in hand. "A brilliant protocol, Doctor. It will rule out any possibility of a novel primary immunodeficiency." He looked at Mrs. Davenport, his expression a practiced mix of empathy and intelligence. "We are at the very frontier of medicine here." As the doctors strategized, Elena's eyes were drawn to a detail they had overlooked. Lying on a chair was a luxurious cashmere travel blanket the family had brought from home. It was draped carelessly, and clinging to its fine fibers was a tiny, dried botanical speck. A leaf fragment, no bigger than her pinky nail, with a distinctive serrated edge and a faint, silvery sheen. Her breath caught in her throat. She had seen it 1,000 times before, on hikes with her grandmother through the misty Appalachian trails of her youth. "Devil's whisper," her grandmother used to call it. Harmless to the touch, but its pollen, if inhaled by someone with a specific sensitivity, could unleash a storm upon the body, a reaction so strange and archaic it wasn't in any medical database. The family had mentioned they'd just returned from a lavish retreat in the Blue Ridge Mountains. It all clicked into place. She knew she had to try again. Protocol dictated she speak to a resident first. She waited until Dr. Ramirez stepped into the hallway to place a call to the lab. She approached him cautiously, keeping her voice low and respectful. "Dr. Ramirez, excuse me," she started. "I may have noticed something." On the family's travel blanket, there's a piece of plant matter. I recognize it from the region they were just visiting. It's known locally to cause. Ramirez didn't even let her finish. He let out a short, incredulous laugh, loud enough for two passing nurses to turn their heads. "Nurse Vance, is it?" he said, making a show of reading her name tag. "Are you a botanist now?" "I am trying to coordinate a genomic sequencing analysis with the top lab in the country, and you are bringing me leaves? Do you have any idea how ridiculous you sound?" The other nurses quickly looked away, their faces a mixture of pity and second-hand embarrassment. "Dr. Finch is a genius," Ramirez continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "His methods are based on science, on data, on peer-reviewed evidence. Not on country folklore about weeds." He shook his head, a smug smile on his face. "Please, go check on the patient's fluid levels. Leave the real work to the doctors." He turned his back and walked away, leaving Elena standing alone in the pristine, white corridor. The humiliation was no longer a private sting, it was a public brand. She was the foolish, uneducated nurse who talked about plants while the men of science were saving a life. She watched them through the window as they prepped the poor boy for another painful, invasive procedure, taking samples of bone marrow this time. They were searching for a monster inside his DNA, digging deeper and deeper into the boy himself, all while the simple, plain-as-day answer was lying on a chair, clinging to a cashmere blanket, completely ignored. Elena felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. Their pride wasn't just insulting her, it was actively endangering the child's life. The hours that followed were a slow, agonizing descent. The boy's condition deteriorated exactly as Elena had feared. The bone marrow aspiration yielded no answers, but it left him weak and feverish. The mysterious rash, once confined to his arms and chest, began to creep up his neck, its pattern of venomous lace against his pale skin. The steady, reassuring rhythm of the heart monitor became a frantic, erratic staccato, an alarm bell that Dr. Finch's team seemed unable to silence. His cutting-edge science was failing, and the cold reality of it began to seep into the hermetically sealed suite. Dr. Finch, who normally commanded his unit with the unshakable certainty of a decorated general, now paced the halls, his face a mask of strained composure. He grew short-tempered, snapping at a junior resident for misplacing a file and blaming the lab for the inconclusive results. His authority, once absolute, was showing cracks. The breaking point came when Mrs. Davenport, her face pale with sleeplessness and terror, cornered him outside the ICU. "My son's heart rate is 150 beats per minute, and you're telling me to be patient?" she hissed, her voice a raw whisper of fury that carried down the entire corridor. This hospital, your reputation, it was all supposed to mean something. It was supposed to mean he was safe. You are failing him, doctor. And I promise you, the world will hear about it. The threat hung in the air, more potent than any medical diagnosis. Dr. Finch's career was built on the confidence of people like the Davenports. Losing it was a death sentence. Panicked, Finch retreated to the doctor's lounge, pulling Dr. Ramirez with him. "What did we miss?" he demanded, throwing a heavy medical tome onto the table. Could it be a cryptic viral infection? A parasitic activator? He was grasping at straws, proposing increasingly esoteric and dangerous theories. Finally, he landed on the most desperate measure. "We'll have to start him on high-dose immunosuppressants. A full chemical reset. It's risky, but it's the only option left." Elena overheard this from the nursing station, and a chill went down her spine. Immunosuppressants. It was like using a sledgehammer to kill a fly. It would leave the boy defenseless, vulnerable to any common infection, and it wouldn't even address the root cause of the allergic reaction. They were so blinded by their search for a complex, headline-worthy disease that they were going to cripple a child's immune system out of sheer pride. She knew, with a certainty that resonated in her very bones, that she could not let that happen. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind, a memory of a stern but loving woman who taught her that the most profound knowledge often came not from books, but from listening to the world. Her moment came when the doctors were called into an emergency consultation and Mrs. Davenport stepped out, her phone pressed to her ear as she argued with her husband. The room was quiet for the first time in hours, the only sound the frantic beeping of the machines. With practiced, steady hands, Elena put on a pair of sterile gloves. She took a sterile specimen bag and, using a pair of tweezers, carefully picked the tiny, dried leaf fragment from the cashmere blanket. It felt impossibly light, a fragile piece of evidence against a mountain of medical dogma. Her plan was desperate. She would take it to the hospital's small, underfunded botany department, to a quiet, elderly researcher who still believed in the value of the natural world. She slipped the sealed bag into her pocket, her heart hammering against her ribs. But as she turned to leave the room, the door swung open. Dr. Finch and Dr. Ramirez stood there, their expressions grim. Ramirez's sharp eyes immediately caught her furtive movement. "Vance? What are you hiding?" he demanded, stepping in front of her, blocking her path. Before she could answer, he reached out and deftly plucked the specimen bag from her pocket. He held it up to the light, a smug, contemptuous sneer forming on his face. "Are you serious?" he spat. "You're still on about this?" Dr. Finch snatched the bag from him, his face a thundercloud of rage and disbelief. "So this is your grand contribution to medical science?" "A piece of a weed," he boomed, his voice echoing in the silent room. Mrs. Davenport had returned, drawn by the noise, and her eyes widened in horror. Finally finding her voice, Elena stood her ground. "That weed is Aconitum murmurans," she said, her tone steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Its pollen contains a rare alkaloid that, in genetically predisposed individuals, causes a systemic inflammatory response. It mimics the symptoms of a severe autoimmune disorder, but it is not. All his symptoms, from the rash to the cardiac arrhythmia, are consistent with advanced exposure." Dr. Finch let out a bark of derisive laughter. "And where did you acquire this brilliant diagnosis, Nurse Vance? A farmer's almanac?" He took a step closer, his eyes boring into hers. "You want to play doctor? Fine. Let's play." He held up the tiny bag. "You seem so certain. So here is the challenge. You have until 7 a.m. tomorrow morning. That is when I begin the immunosuppressive therapy. If you can bring me absolute, undeniable, scientific proof that this foliage is the cause of this boy's condition, I will stop the treatment. But if you cannot, I will personally see to it that you are fired for gross insubordination and you will never practice nursing in this state again. Your career will be over. A career on the line, a child's life in the balance, and an impossible deadline." Dr. Finch thinks he has cornered her, using his power to crush the truth. Elena's fight is for every person who has ever been underestimated, silenced, or dismissed by arrogance. If you believe that true knowledge is more powerful than a fancy degree, and you're rooting for her to win this impossible challenge, then support our stories by hitting that subscribe button right now. You are not going to want to miss the moment this humble nurse gets the ultimate vindication. Dr. Finch's words hung in the air, a formal declaration of war. He expected Elena to crumble, to apologize, to shrink back into the obedient role he had assigned her. Instead, she met his gaze, and for the first time, he saw not a timid nurse, but a woman of unshakable resolve. She gave a single, sharp nod. 7 a.m., she confirmed, her voice quiet but clear as a bell. Then, without another word, she turned and walked out of the suite, leaving behind a stunned silence. Her acceptance was so devoid of drama, so full of calm purpose, that it momentarily unnerved both Dr. Finch and Dr. Ramirez. For a split second, a flicker of doubt crossed Finch's mind, but he quickly extinguished it with a wave of renewed arrogance. He turned to Ramirez. "Prepare her termination paperwork. And get the immunosuppressant protocol ready. We're proceeding on schedule." Elena didn't run. She walked, her steps measured and deliberate, a stark contrast to the frantic chaos in her mind. The hospital at night was a different world, a labyrinth of quiet, sterile corridors bathed in the cold, artificial glow of fluorescent lights. Her destination was the basement, a place most of the star doctors on the upper floors had never even seen. There, tucked away behind a steam pipe and marked by a faded sign, was the hospital's botany and toxicology research lab. It was a relic, an underfunded department from a bygone era, now maintained by one man, Dr. Eris Thorne. Dr. Thorne was the antithesis of Alastair Finch. A man in his late 70s with kind eyes magnified by thick glasses, he was a scholar of the old school who believed there was knowledge in a seed pod that could rival anything found in a genomic sequence. Elena found him hunched over a microscope, sketching the cell structure of a fern. He looked up, his face breaking into a warm smile when he saw her. "Elena." "Burning the midnight oil, I see," he said gently. Her words came out in a rush, a torrent of medical data, patient history, and the impossible ultimatum she was facing. She placed the small specimen bag on his cluttered workbench. He listened patiently, his smile slowly fading, replaced by a look of intense concentration. He picked up the bag, examining the leaf fragment under a desk lamp. "Aconitum murmurans," he whispered, his eyes wide with a mixture of academic excitement and alarm. "Good heavens, child. It's rare to see a sample this far south. It's notoriously difficult to identify without its flower. How could you be so sure?" This was her moment. This was where her world, the one the doctors upstairs dismissed as folklore, proved its worth. "The serration pattern on the leaf edge is unique," she explained, her voice gaining confidence. "It has 7 points, but the third and fifth are always slightly shallower than the others. And when you crush a fresh leaf, it smells faintly of whetstone and honey. My grandmother taught me to spot it. She used a poultice from the root to treat joint pain, but she always warned that the pollen was a ghost wind, it could steal the breath of the unwary." Dr. Thorne stared at her, mesmerized. It was a perfect fusion of empirical observation and ancestral knowledge. "Astonishing," he murmured. "But Elena, to prove this to a man like Finch, we need more than folklore. We need data. Hard, irrefutable data. We have to isolate the alkaloid. And my equipment, it's not what it used to be." He gestured around the lab. It was a museum of aging technology. The mass spectrometer was a behemoth from the 1990s, and the gas chromatograph was notoriously temperamental. Getting a clean reading in under a week would be a miracle. But Elena's hidden talent was not just an identification, it was an application. "We don't have a week," she said firmly. "We have until dawn. And we don't need a full-spectrum analysis. We are looking for one specific compound, muraminine. Its molecular weight is 645.7 grams per mole. We can calibrate the spectrometer to search for that precise peak." Dr. Thorne blinked. "How do you know that?" "I read your thesis on neurotoxic alkaloids when I first started working here," she said simply, a faint blush on her cheeks. Stunned into action, Dr. Thorne became her willing partner. But it was Elena who led the charge. The textbook procedure for extracting alkaloids was slow and inefficient. Elena, however, remembered her grandmother's process for creating tinctures. "We need a methanol chloroform solvent at a 2-to-1 ratio," she instructed, moving around the lab with an efficiency that belied her panic. "And we have to heat it to exactly 40 degrees Celsius. Any hotter, and the alkaloid will denature. Any cooler, and the extraction will take all night." For hours, they worked in a silent, focused dance. Elena's hands, which had so skillfully managed 4 lines and patient charts, were just as adept at handling beakers and pipettes. She prepared the sample with a naturalist's intuition and a clinician's precision. The old machines hummed and whirred, protesting as they were pushed to their limits. The air grew thick with the smell of solvents and ozone. Twice, the spectrometer faltered, its vacuum pump threatening to fail, and each time Dr. Thorne managed to coax it back to life. As the first gray hints of dawn began to touch the sky outside the small basement window, the machine finally spat out a printout. They both leaned over it, their hopes sinking. The graph was a mess of electronic noise, jagged peaks and valleys signifying nothing. It was useless. But then, Elena's observant eyes caught it. Tucked away in the far right of the graph, almost completely obscured by static, was a tiny, faint spike. A ghost. She grabbed a ruler, her hands trembling as she aligned it with the x-axis. It lined up perfectly. 645.7. There, she breathed. It's there. Dr. Thorne peered at it, his heart aching for her. It is, he agreed softly. But it's not enough, Elena. It's barely a whisper of a signal. Finch will call it a statistical error. He'll laugh us out of the room. This isn't proof. It's a hint. And we are out of time. Despair, cold and sharp, pierced through Elena's exhaustion. The clock on the lab wall ticked with brutal finality. 6:15 a.m. less than an hour left. Dr. Thorne put a comforting hand on her shoulder. You were right, Elena, he said, his voice heavy with regret. But our old equipment, it's like trying to hear a whisper in a hurricane. This graph won't convince anyone, let alone a man who doesn't want to be convinced. He was right. Finch would shred the evidence, and the boy upstairs would be pumped full of dangerous drugs while the true cause, the ghost wind of the mountains, continued its silent assault. Elena stared at the specimen bag containing the leaf, then at the noisy, useless printout. Her mind raced, replaying every moment, every symptom, every textbook page she had ever read. A whisper in a hurricane. The phrase snagged in her mind. And then, it hit her. A lightning bolt of an idea, so radical and yet so simple, it made her gasp. We've been doing it wrong, she said, her voice electric with sudden insight. We've been trying to prove the plant is the poison. We don't have the time or the technology for that. We need to prove the boy is the target. Dr. Thorne looked at her, confused. What do you mean? The allergy is the reaction, she explained, thinking aloud, the pieces clicking into place. The pollen itself isn't a universal poison. It's a key. And it only fits one specific lock, the boy's immune cells. We don't need a mass spectrometer. We need a microscope. We need to show what happens when the key meets the lock. We need to watch the reaction happen on a cellular level. The sheer brilliance of the pivot left Dr. Thorne speechless for a moment. It was a perfect diagnostic maneuver, sidestepping their technological weakness and going straight for the biological truth. A cellular histamine release assay, he breathed, his eyes alight with renewed hope. Yes. We could introduce the pollen to his blood serum and stain for histamine. If his basophils degranulate, it's the smoking gun. But we'd need a flow cytometer to measure it accurately, and we need a fresh sample of the patient's blood. The hope in his eyes died as quickly as it had appeared. The hematology lab and its advanced equipment were on the 5th floor, Finch's territory. And getting a new blood sample was impossible. But Elena's mind was already 2 steps ahead. I drew a full panel on the patient for his morning labs yesterday, she said. Before Dr. Finch locked down the case. There's a purple top tube with his name on it, sitting in the refrigerated archives at the nursing station. It's still viable. Elena, you can't, Dr. Thorne warned, his voice grave. Taking a sample for an unauthorized test, that's not just insubordination. That's a massive violation. They could take your license. They're going to take my career anyway, she replied, her face set like stone. This is for the boy. Leaving Dr. Thorne to frantically prepare the necessary slides and reagents, Elena made her way back to the lion's den. The 5th floor ICU was beginning to stir with the pre-dawn shift change. She saw Dr. Ramirez standing near the nursing station, preening, laughing with another resident, basking in the glory of his mentor's supposed victory. He was holding a file, and she could just make out her own name on the tab. He was waiting for her to fail. Seeing him there, so smug and certain, ignited a cold fire in her belly. She couldn't confront him. She had to be a ghost. She slipped down a service corridor, her knowledge of the hospital's back passages serving her well. She emerged near the linen supply closet, grabbing a stack of clean towels as a prop. Walking with the practiced, unhurried air of someone on a routine task, she approached the station from the opposite side. The nurses were busy with the shift handover report. Ramirez had his back to the archive refrigerator. It was now or never. With her heart pounding in her ears, she opened the small refrigerator, her eyes scanning the racks of labeled tubes. Davenport. There it was. Her fingers, cold with adrenaline, closed around the small glass vial. She slipped it into her pocket, closed the door with a soft click, and walked away, not daring to look back until she was safely in the stairwell, her precious cargo secure. Back in the basement lab, the air was thick with tension. It was 6:45 a.m. Dr. Thorne had 2 slides ready under a powerful fluorescence microscope. One contained a drop of his own blood, the control. The other held the patient's. He had already introduced the pollen extract to both. Now, they needed to add the final component, the fluorescent dye that would bind to histamine, the chemical signature of an allergic reaction, and make it glow. Elena carefully added a drop of the glowing green stain to each slide. They waited. 1 minute. 2 minutes. The control slide with Dr. Thorne's blood remained dark, inert. The patient's slide also remained dark. 6:52 a.m. The crushing weight of failure returned. Maybe her theory was wrong. Maybe it was all for nothing. Wait, Dr. Thorne whispered, his eye pressed to the microscope. Look. Elena leaned over the second eyepiece. At first, she saw nothing but the dark shapes of the dormant blood cells. Then, she saw a flicker. One of the large, granular basophils, an immune cell, seemed to tremble as it drifted near a grain of pollen. And then it happened. The cell erupted. It was a silent, microscopic detonation, a puff of incandescent green as the cell wall ruptured and released its entire payload of histamine. The dye ignited it, turning the explosion into a bloom of brilliant, emerald light. Then another cell erupted, and another, and another. Soon, the entire slide was a raging, silent firestorm, a cataclysm of green light, a beautiful and terrifying map of the war being waged inside the boy's body. It was absolute. It was undeniable. It was proof. They stared at the screen, breathless. The control slide was dark. The patient's slide was ablaze. The clock on the wall read 6:58 a.m. They had their whisper. And they had turned it into a roar. The clock on the wall of the ICU suite struck 7. The sound, usually a gentle chime, echoed like a death knell. Dr. Alastair Finch stood with his arms crossed, a portrait of grim authority. Dr. Ramirez stood beside him, holding a syringe filled with the clear, potent immunosuppressant fluid. He had an almost theatrical look of sorrow on his face, a performance for the boy's distraught mother. Mrs. Davenport, her face a mess of tear-streaked makeup, wrung her hands, having resigned herself to this last, desperate measure. "It is 7 a.m., Dr. Finch announced, his voice resonating with false finality. "As I predicted, Nurse Vance's fanciful theories have produced nothing. We will now proceed with the only viable medical option." He nodded at Ramirez. "Administer the first dose." As Ramirez uncapped the needle and moved toward the boy's foreport, the door to the suite swung open with a decisive push. Elena stood in the doorway, her uniform wrinkled, her face pale with exhaustion, but her eyes burning with a brilliant intensity. She was not alone. Beside her stood Dr. Eris Thorne, his back straight, his old-fashioned tweed jacket a stark contrast to the sterile white coats of the other doctors. He was carrying a laptop and a compact digital microscope. They didn't look like saviors, they looked like a tired nurse and a history professor. Finch let out a contemptuous snort. Well. Look what the cat dragged in. You're late, nurse. And you've brought the groundskeeper with you for moral support? This is utterly unprofessional." Dr. Thorne stepped forward, his calm demeanor an unshakable shield against Finch's venom. "My name is Dr. Eris Thorne," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an immense weight of authority. "I hold a doctorate in cellular toxicology from Johns Hopkins University. And for the record, Doctor, it is 7:02. We are not late. We are precisely on time." Ignoring the sputtering doctors, Elena walked directly to the foot of the patient's bed. She looked at Mrs. Davenport, her gaze steady and full of empathy. "You asked for answers. Dr. Finch asked for irrefutable proof." She gestured to the equipment Dr. Thorne was now calmly setting up on a rolling table. "Here it is." Dr. Thorne plugged the microscope into the laptop and switched it on. He placed the slide, the one containing the boy's blood, still faintly glowing from the reaction, under the lens. An image flickered onto the laptop screen, and the entire room fell silent. It was the image of the cellular war. A field of blood cells, and scattered among them, incandescent explosions of brilliant green light. The silent, beautiful, horrifying proof of the allergic reaction, playing out on a microscopic scale. The change in the room was instantaneous. Dr. Ramirez's smug expression dissolved into slack-jawed disbelief. He stared from the syringe in his hand to the glowing screen, his mind struggling to reconcile the primitive folklore he had mocked with the advanced cellular biology unfolding before his eyes. The syringe suddenly seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds. Mrs. Davenport let out a sharp, choked gasp. She didn't understand the science, but she understood the violent imagery. "My God," she whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. "What is that? What's happening inside him?" For the first time, she was looking not at the famous doctor, but at the humble nurse, her eyes wide with a desperate plea for the truth. But the most profound reaction was Dr. Finch's. He shoved past Ramirez and stared at the screen, his clinical mind immediately recognizing the phenomenon. Massive basophil degranulation. Anaphylaxis at a cellular level. It was a reaction so violent, so perfect in its textbook horror, that he had only ever seen it in simulations. He looked at the faint outlines of the pollen grains acting as triggers. Then he looked at Elena, the nurse he had dismissed with a wave of his hand. The foundation of his world, built on smug certainty and academic prestige, crumbled to dust in that single moment. The color drained from his face, his armor of arrogance shattered, leaving only the pale, naked shock of a man who had been proven catastrophically wrong. Dr. Thorne provided the clinical narration, his voice calm and didactic, as if delivering a university lecture. "What you are witnessing is a textbook example of a type 1 hypersensitivity reaction. A severe mast cell activation syndrome triggered by a specific protein within the Aconitum murmurans pollen. The immunosuppressants you were about to administer," he said, gesturing to the syringe in Ramirez's trembling hand, "would have been useless. Worse, they would have crippled his ability to fight off any secondary infection while this reaction continued unabated. You would have been chasing a ghost, doctor, while the real fire burned his body down from the inside." Then Elena spoke, her voice clear and professional, devoid of any triumph or malice. She was a nurse, and her focus was on the patient. "The solution is simple," she said. "We remove the source of the allergen. The blanket, all of his personal belongings from their trip. We need to put a HEPA filter in this room immediately. Then, we start him on a 4-drip of diphenhydramine and a low-dose corticosteroid to counter the systemic inflammation. He's strong. Once the trigger is gone, his body will begin to recover within hours." The devastating simplicity of her plan hung in the air. Finch's dangerous, last-ditch effort versus her precise, elegant, and correct solution. He had been trying to rewrite the book, she had simply read the first page correctly. Humbled, broken, and utterly defeated, Dr. Finch could only stare at the screen. He finally turned to Dr. Ramirez, his voice a hoarse, unrecognizable whisper. "Put it down." Dr. Ramirez's hand trembled as he placed the syringe on the sterile steel tray. The click of plastic on metal was the only sound in the room, a tiny punctuation mark at the end of Dr. Finch's reign. The battle was over, the victory absolute, yet Elena Vance felt no surge of triumph. She only felt the pressing need to care for her patient. As if a switch had been flipped, she was no longer a challenger or a visionary, she was a nurse. She turned to the small crowd of her colleagues who had gathered at the doorway, their faces a mixture of shock and awe. Her voice, once ignored, now commanded the room with an effortless authority born of pure competence. "I need a HEPA filter from Central Supply, Stat," she ordered, her tone calm and clear. "Let's get a complete linen and curtain change in here, anything that might have come into contact with the allergen. Page the pharmacy, I need an 4 of solomedrol and 50 milligrams of diphenhydramine. Let's move." The nurses, who hours before had averted their eyes in pity, now jumped into action with a loyalty and speed they had never shown for Dr. Finch. They saw in her not a superior, but a true leader. In that moment, the rigid, artificial hierarchy of the hospital evaporated, replaced by a simple, powerful truth: competence was the only rank that mattered. Mrs. Davenport, her face streaked with tears of relief, rushed to Elena's side and grabbed her arm. The cold, imperious woman was gone, replaced by a grateful, humbled mother. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "You saved him. You saved my son when no one else could. How can I possibly repay you?" Elena gently placed her hand over Mrs. Davenport's. "There's nothing to repay, ma'am. I was just doing my job. Now, let's focus on getting your son comfortable." Her victory wasn't in the apology or the praise, it was in the steady, rhythmic beep of the monitor, which was already beginning to slow from its frantic pace. While Elena orchestrated the boy's care, the fallout for the vanquished began. Dr. Finch stood frozen for a long moment, a statue of broken pride. The entire clinical picture replayed in his mind: his own arrogance, his condescending dismissals, his catastrophic error in judgment. He had been so obsessed with discovering a rare disease that he could name after himself that he had completely missed the simple truth right in front of him. He turned, his movements stiff and robotic, and walked out of the room. He didn't look at Elena. He didn't look at his disgraced protégé. He walked past the nurses who now refused to meet his gaze, past the portraits of the hospital's founding fathers, his own face feeling like a fraudulent mask. His walk was a public parade of shame, each step taking him further from the career he had built and loved, and straight toward the hospital director's office to tender his resignation. Dr. Ramirez was left behind, an anchorless ship in the storm of his own making. The syringe on the tray seemed to mock him, a symbol of his blind sycophancy. He remembered his words in the hallway, sneering about country folklore and fluffing pillows. The memory burned with a shame so intense it felt like a physical illness. He tried to make himself useful, to offer help, but his voice was a worthless croak. The nurses he once looked down upon now moved around him as if he were a ghost. With trembling hands, he collected the useless immunosuppressant kit and slunk out of the room, the bright future he had imagined for himself just hours before now a dark, empty void. The results of Elena's intervention were astonishingly swift. With the allergens removed and the correct, simple medications administered, the boy's body began to heal itself. Within 2 hours, the angry red rash had faded to a pale pink. His breathing, once shallow and labored, became deep and even. By midday, the fever was gone. By late afternoon, he was awake, sitting up in bed, and asking for ice cream. The recovery was so rapid and complete that it felt like a miracle. But Elena knew it wasn't a miracle. It was just the logical outcome of listening, observing, and respecting a different kind of knowledge. She sat by his bedside, charting his progress, her presence a calm and reassuring constant. The story, however, was just beginning to spread. The tale of the quiet nurse who showed up the celebrity doctor, of the humble wisdom that defeated arrogant science, was too good not to be told. It moved through the hospital's shifts, from the surgical wing to the cafeteria, whispered with a satisfying sense of justice. And it reached the top floor. The Davenport family, a name that made hospital boards tremble, made their position unequivocally clear. They owed their son's life to one person, and it wasn't the famous doctor they had hired. They demanded a full investigation and appropriate consequences for those who had nearly killed their son through negligence and pride. But more than that, they demanded full and public recognition for Nurse Elena Vance. The wheels of karmic justice had begun to turn. The consequences for Dr. Finch and his protégé were as swift and severe as the boy's recovery. The hospital board, terrified of a lawsuit from the formidable Davenport family and an irreversible stain on their pristine reputation, acted decisively. Dr. Finch's resignation was accepted before his letter was even officially typed. Within a week, his name was removed from the hospital's website, his portrait taken down from the Physicians of Excellence wall. Medical journals that once clamored for his opinion now ran speculative articles about the spectacular diagnostic failure at Montclair Pinnacle. His fall from grace was absolute. The man who saw himself as a god of medicine was exiled from his Olympus, eventually taking a quiet, anonymous research position at a small state university, a ghost haunting the footnotes of medical literature instead of its headlines. Dr. Ramirez faced a different, more instructive, form of justice. The internal investigation, driven by testimony from several nurses who had witnessed his public humiliation of Elena, found him guilty of gross professional negligence and creating a toxic work environment. He was summarily dismissed from Montclair's prestigious residency program. The black mark on his record made him untouchable to any other top-tier hospital. His only option was to accept a position in a small, underfunded rural clinic in the very Appalachian region Elena came from. His penance was not just exile, but a forced education in humility. He would spend his years learning medicine not from celebrity doctors, but from overworked general practitioners and, ironically, from nurses who possessed the very kind of practical, grounded knowledge he had once so arrogantly dismissed. Mrs. Davenport's justice was a profound personal transformation. Shaken to her core, she saw the hollowness of the world of status and prestige she had so fervently believed in. She became a fierce and vocal advocate for nursing staff. A week after her son's discharge, she made a multi-million-dollar donation to the hospital with a single, unshakable condition: the establishment of the Elena Vance Grant for Interdisciplinary Medical Research, a fund specifically designed to finance projects led by nurses in collaboration with other hospital departments. Her act was not one of charity, but of correction, ensuring that no other voice as vital as Elena's would ever be silenced again. In the midst of this whirlwind, the hospital administration saw a golden PR opportunity. They called Elena to the director's suite, a place she had only ever seen from the outside. They offered her a promotion, a newly created position, Director of Nursing Integration, complete with a massive salary increase, a spacious office on the top floor, and a corporate title. They wanted to put her on posters, to make her the smiling face of their new commitment to listening. They wanted to absorb her, to turn her quiet power into a marketable brand. And in a move that shocked them more than her initial diagnosis, Elena politely but firmly declined. "Thank you for the generous offer," she said, her voice filled with the same calm sincerity she'd shown all along. "But my place isn't behind a desk. My place is with my patients. That is where I can do the most good." She didn't need their title, their office, or their validation. She had never been fighting for a promotion. She had been fighting for a child's life. Weeks later, Montclair Pinnacle Hospital was both the same and fundamentally different. Elena Vance still wore her simple, well-worn scrubs and comfortable shoes. She still walked the halls with a quiet, observant demeanor. But now, the halls walked differently around her. Doctors, including the new, more humble head of diagnostics, would stop her to ask her opinion on a confusing case. Residents would trail her, listening intently as she explained a patient's subtle symptoms. The other nurses saw her not just as a hero, but as a mentor, a living embodiment of their profession's true value. One sunny afternoon, she was on her break in the hospital's small garden, sitting on a bench with Dr. Thorne. They were examining a common plant, with Elena explaining its traditional use as a mild sedative. Across the lawn, the young Davenport boy, now vibrant and healthy, was chasing a butterfly, his laughter echoing in the air. He ran over to her, showing her a colorful feather he'd found. Elena smiled, her face lit with a genuine, unburdened joy. She hadn't risen to the top of their world. She had simply forced their world to recognize the value of hers. Her victory was not in becoming a director or a celebrity, but in returning to the life she had chosen, now with the quiet, unshakable respect she had earned, proving that a person's worth is not measured by the height of their office, but by the depth of their integrity. Elena's story is a powerful reminder that true strength isn't loud and arrogant, it's quiet, competent, and unshakable. She didn't need to defeat Dr. Finch to win, she just needed to be true to herself. Her victory wasn't a promotion, but the simple, profound act of saving a life by using the wisdom others were too proud to see. We all have a bit of Elena in us. Have you ever had a moment where your quiet knowledge was underestimated? Share your experience in the comments below. We want to hear your story and build a community that celebrates these hidden strengths. If tales of integrity, humility, and sweet justice are what you love to see, make sure you hit that follow button and join us for our next story. You are a vital part of this channel, and we can't wait to see you again.